Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
us. Glad you could join us for this conversation about industrial policy and innovation strategy. We have a terrific panel lined up to talk over the next 40 on industrial policy and for making this event possible. We couldn't do these things without our generous support of our sponsors. We appreciate that. I'm just going to make a few framing remarks and then let our panelists do most of the talking here. Terrific group lined up. If you have questions, I'm going to take a way for you to offer questions. So please feel free to do that. So industrial policy is a kind of dirty word in Washington, or it has been. I'm not quite sure why. I've struggled with that a bit because we've been doing it for a long time, and people who I admire, from Alexander Hamilton to Rob Atkinson, have been calling for it for a long time, and other people do it. So I'm not quite sure, but it is controversial, or it has been. It seems to be somewhat, the conversation seems to be changing. It's coming a little bit more back into vogue as even prominent Republicans like Marco Rubio and several others in the Senate and beyond have made the case that we need to have government actively working in an intelligent way to direct resources and support otherwise particular industries, particularly in critical technologies, beyond just broad support for the innovation sort of foundations of education and infrastructure and R&D and so forth, although that's part of the story too. And there's lots of pieces of legislation now on the Hill to support the semiconductor industry, to develop regional technology hubs. And these are bipartisan pieces of legislation that show that there's a broader support. I think a lot of this is being prompted by China, and we're going to talk about China, no doubt, but I think there are probably some other things going on as well that are feeding into this story. So I think we're going to largely broadly focus on two big questions. Is the U.S. losing its innovation edge? And secondly, what should we do about it? And what's the role of government in that regard? I do want to focus largely on the United States. It's easy to talk a lot about China, and everybody on this call does that often and can do that eloquently and at length. But I really want to focus on the United States and our problems and solutions largely, but we can't avoid China, so we will touch on that. We just put out a report yesterday on this topic or set of topics. We did, my research associate Dylan Gerstel did some terrific research on Japan, Europe, and the United States itself historically, and how they've approached these issues. And we derived from all of that some takeaways and principles and lessons learned, including the fact that leveraging government as a consumer, as a buyer of technology is an important way to spur and create markets and create incentives. Another sort of principle we came away with, that it's important for the government to be willing to take risks and tolerate failure in its policy approaches. The government should be working to accelerate regulatory approval processes for early stage technologies and a number of other things. You can find our report also on the event page or on the CSIS website. So I commend that to you. That's enough introduction from me. Let me now move to the panelists. We've got just a terrific group here, and let me introduce them in alphabetical order. First, Rob Atkinson is founder and president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Rob's well known, I think, probably to this audience. He's been involved in innovation policy for decades. He was on the Obama administration's National Innovation and Competitive Strategy Advisory Board, that's a mouthful, and the Trump administration appointed him to the G7 Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence. He wrote a book recently called Big is Beautiful, and he also has written a lot, even in the last month or last few weeks, about innovation strategy, debunking some myths, for example, about that in a recent article, which I commend to you. Next is Derek Scissors. He's resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on the Chinese economy and US relations with Asia. And he's also chief economist at the China Beige Book. He's worked at the Heritage Foundation, taught at George Washington University, worked at the Defense Department, and he has a terrific tracker of Chinese investment, the Global Investment Tracker, I think it's called, which is really a terrific resource that we use at CSIS as well. So delighted to have Derek with us. And then last but not least is Deborah Wintz-Smith. She's president and CEO of the Council on Competitiveness, a coalition of CEOs. Before joining the council, she served as the first Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary for Technology Policy at the Department of Commerce, and worked in the Reagan White House as well, where she designed new forms of public-private partnership and worked on Semitech. Let me start with Deborah. In this first sort of round, talk to us, Deborah, about what you see as the problem. Is the U.S. losing its innovation edge? There we go.
Yes.
Thanks.
Good morning. Thank you, Matt. And let me congratulate you and CSIS for the excellent report that you released, which is very timely and really addresses both the historic. My career, which, as you said, has spanned many administrations and now working through the leadership of the Council on Competitiveness, we really have had an industrial policy in the United States, whether we call it that or in government with our private sector, to advance our economic well-being and national security. So I hope moving forward, whether we call it industrial policy strategy or really how do we drive economic critical that we address these emerging challenges. Well, first of all, the United States is really still the epicenter of innovation. We have incredible universities, national labs, been the game changers in creating new industries and capabilities that never existed before. And you marry that with an entrepreneur growth, recognizing our national security needs, and it's a very, very powerful platform to build upon. Having said that, when you look at our R&D investments, and of course R&D investments, and we can go back to reading not kept up with our strategic federal investments in R&D to the extent that we did in an earlier time of our history. And this is a very, very serious issue because we are de-invested. Global R&D and our private sector is very much at the forefront of that, well over pushing $600 billion. But the core basic research, the fundamental research that increasingly aligns with the number 7th vis-a-vis global peers, with Korea far outranking us in investments as a percentage of GDP. And of course, that's just one metric. The other issue really is that we are falling behind in actually channeling the very significant risk capital into, and this is something I know we'll discuss in more detail during the program. But just to give an example, and I hope we discuss this at some length, you did mention I was involved when I was in the Reagan White House Science Office in the whole establishment of Semitech, which was one of the very early seminal public-private partnerships. It was driven from the national security side with the Defense Department. But at the time, there was a strong recognition, and this, of course, goes back to the challenges with Japan in that era, that the U.S. really had to bring together the whole infrastructure around microelectronics, not just the chips, but the equipment, the suppliers. And so we put together this public-private partnership that invested at a huge scale to bring all these partners together. Venture capital could not play in this space. And this is a very important point I want to make throughout our discussion in terms of the tools going forward. We really have to look at new models of financing, new public-private partnerships to address these foundational platform capabilities that China in particular, but the rest of the world are really targeting. That at the end of the day, if we don't have leadership, not just in the design and the research and development, but the actual production at scale of these platform technologies, we will see our economic prowess, our national security, and very importantly, the drivers of productivity very much at risk. So I'll stop there. I know we're going to talk about some of the actual technologies we're talking about. We all know what they are across the platforms of advanced computing. We certainly have led the world and continue, thankfully, to our national labs and our partnerships with industry to return to our leadership in advanced computing beyond exascale computation to support government missions. But there are many, many other capabilities that we have to now readdress how we invest in this discussion. I want to talk, and I hope my colleagues will, about our tax and fiscal structures, our regular called industrial policy, or I would rather say policies for innovation and economic growth and sustainability for our citizens.
Issues in the sort of next round. But Rob, let me ask you to give your sort of overall diagnosis of the.
To really frame what it is we're looking at, ITIF wrote a report a few years ago called the Competitiveness, Innovation, and Productivity Clearing Cycle Performance. One is productivity. That's very important, as Deborah alluded to. The second is innovation. And the third is competitive non-traded sector in your healthcare sector and in your garbage collection sector. It might not do very much for your trade economy that are traded across international lines, sectors like semiconductors or pharmaceuticals or automobiles. It's not going to, particularly in advanced sectors. We've lost a lot of furniture production, for example, and I feel bad for the other sectors where we haven't done well and that are much more about innovation and advanced technology. That, to me, is what really we ought to be focusing on now over the next few years. Part of the problem in understanding why there's a challenge is really, I think, two big problems. One, Deborah alluded to all of our strengths. Federal government spent more on R&D than every other country in the world combined, business and government. So of course we were going to be good. Of course we were going to be strong. But it's a little bit like looking at a star that's gone supernova. The star is blowing up, but all you see is the star. And I worry that one of the things that we're looking at is we're really kind of in our minds looking at the US economy and its performance from 10 or 15 or even 20 years ago. The second big problem we have is that we tend to underestimate the problem because we look at US firms. And yeah, there are a lot of US firms that are doing quite well in technology. That's not the issue. The issue is the US economy. So it's not about US firms, it's about enterprises that are in the US. So some of those firms are doing quite well, but a lot of their production, a lot of their R&D is offshore. I'm not saying that's inherently wrong or bad, but it's irrelevant in some ways to what we ought to be looking at. And similarly with internet giants, people deny there's a problem because we have Apple and Google and Facebook and Amazon, although if we go after them with aggressive antitrust, we may not. But I think we have to look beyond that. China obviously is a big issue. And again, there, I think part of the problem is people are looking in the rearview mirror at China. They're looking at where China was 10 years ago, not where China is today. There's a recent report we issued at ITIF called, "Is China Catching Up to the US in Innovation?" And the answer is yes. We looked at 36 indicators, and there's been dramatic progress on most of the 36 indicators over the last decade in terms of them cutting the gap between the US. In fact, in some of the indicators actually exceeding where we are. Then when you look at actual performance, which is obviously the most important thing, you see very troubling statistics. The most accurate measure is what's called real value added. In other words, inflation adjusted value added. What are companies adding in value? And when you look at that in terms of manufacturing, again, where most of the important sectors are, although I would put software and some of the information sectors in there as well. But in terms of manufacturing, what you found was that between 2007 and 2019, real value added declined 13%. In other words, we're producing 13% less than we were, 15, 14 years ago. And when you control for, it's a complicated issue, but essentially the government vastly overstates output in the computer sector because of Moore's law. When you control for that, it's actually 20% decline in manufacturing. For example, we're producing 39% fewer pharmaceutical goods compared to GDP growth, 17% less machinery, 16% other computer and electronics, 8% fewer motor vehicle output. And that's reflected in the trade deficit. We ran last year about $134 billion trade deficit in advanced technology products. And that's down from about a $5 billion trade surplus in 2001. And lastly, there's a whole set of iconic U.S. technology firms that we still think of as iconic, but they're a lot weaker than they used to be. Obviously, firms that are just gone out of business, Lucent, Motorola, and Nortel. To take one example, I wrote a recent article in the Journal of American Affairs called "Who Lost Lucent? Why did we lose Lucent?" In 2000, we had by far the three dominant players in the telecom equipment industry: Lucent, Motorola, and Nortel. Nortel was Canadian, but most of their jobs are in the US. They're all gone. You look at, again, once iconic companies like IBM, HP, General Electric, their ranking on the Forbes 2000 list has fallen dramatically over the last 15 years. So again, not to say that we don't have strengths, not to say that we don't have capabilities, but I think we really have to look at this as a wake-up call that it's time to act. So thank you.
Terrific, and a lot there, but I also do want to get Derek in, and then I want to come back and ask you what to do about all that. So Derek, in particular, both Rob and Deborah have talked about China in passing, but it's obviously a critical factor. And how do you sort of look at China's catch up and how that affects our position, our competitiveness? Are we really at risk here, or is this something we can handle?
Thanks, Matt. I'm going to emphasize China. I would say that I could do this for Japan and Korea too. Obviously, it would be different. But I'm basically going to take off on Rob's point about don't be fooled about what the US looked like 15 years ago, which I think is exactly right, and apply it to the Chinese. And if I push back in time, I could do the same thing with Japan, and a little more recently, I could do the same thing with Korea. The idea that China has been rising in terms of success for 40 years is wrong. I am going to get to innovation here, but I want to lay this out because I think we can focus too much on a narrow set of indicators for success and think that we've achieved a good industrial policy. It turns out not to be the case. For about 25, 30 years, when China engaged in pro-competition reform, it was making its country more prosperous. The last 12 to 15 have seen it get bigger, but weaken structurally and not make the country as a whole more prosperous. We could do this with Korea and Japan as well, that they had these periods of increasing prosperity and then they ran into trouble. And that the fundamental question I have is for the United States when we're judging how we're doing, and there are clearly problems, and I'm not disagreeing with either of the colleagues on the panel about the problems, but what are we trying to accomplish? Do we want to spend more and have a bigger spending and activity footprint, or do we want the economy to be better as a whole? And if you look at the Chinese, they have worse demographics than we do. It's about to be horribly worse. They already have a horribly worse resource dependence than we do. Now you could say that's independent from industrial policy. I don't think it is. I don't think you can have a very powerful focus on industrial policy and then manage the rest of your economy perfectly. But if you think you can do that, let's go on to something that's clearly connected to industrial policy, which is debt. We already have an enormous debt burden in this country. It's going to be when we get into solutions, it's going to be relevant to our solutions. But looking at the Chinese have a similar debt burden now. They actually ran last year, this year will be different, a larger fiscal deficit than we did. They have borrowed far more money in the past 12 years than we have, and we have not exactly been responsible. So Chinese industrial policy success is built on borrowing. It's not paying for itself. And they're still at about 1/10 the US level of personal income. So they're not only more indebted, they're more indebted at a much earlier place in the cycle where we were not indebted. This is not a successful outline. This is not what I want American industrial policy to do for the United States. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I want to get to what we should do looking forward. But on innovation itself, as we know from the East Asian examples, not just China, it's much easier to rise until you get near the top. And then it's much harder for innovation to drive growth and prosperity in your society. So that's one lesson. The second lesson here is, does spending matter more? Does competition matter more? And I really do want to hear from my colleagues on the panel and from people in the audience about what they think. I find spending in many ways to be harmful. I don't want to put words in Rob's mouth, but ITIF has done a good job pointing out that the Chinese harm, in my opinion, they've done a good job pointing out that the Chinese harm global innovation. And what they do is they subsidize uninnovative firms at the expense of innovative firms. And that is a key challenge that we would face in adopting an industrial policy. We can hurt other countries with our industrial policy. There's no doubt about that. But can we help our own innovation and can we make our society more prosperous? When we look around and see that we're losing, I think we need to widen the lens and find out, we're losing on these grounds and they matter, but the countries that we're pointing to as models are not doing very well overall.
Okay, terrific. And I know that you and Rob have debated these issues passionately in the past. And so I'm sure that Rob has an answer for that. And you can wind that in to your answer, Rob. But what's your kind of overall approach and argument for why we need a more intelligent innovation strategy? And what are the elements of that?
Sure. So, Derek and I have had this conversation before. But I think the most important thing to understand is there are multiple things that you want to accomplish with your national economic policies. And, I would agree with Derek. The most important one is probably productivity growth, because that's the underlying driver of GDP growth and income growth and wage growth. But we cannot afford, you could have a very high GDP growth and have a very weak traded sector. You could have you could have a strong traded sector in oil and waste paper. I mean, we sell the Chinese a lot of waste paper. It's not going to do us very well if there's any kind of conflict that breaks out. So I think I think they're just completely two different things. The Chinese absolutely have a bad macroeconomic policy. They ignore productivity. They waste an enormous amount of money. I don't care, because what they do with all of that money that they're essentially wasting is they're putting it directly into beating us in advanced technology industries. And I don't think there's any way the US can afford to lose in those sectors. And there's, I think, two big reasons why we can't afford to lose in there. One is, we have to be able to have a reasonably strong terms of trade. If we keep losing our traded sectors, we keep losing our ability to export effectively. There's only really one answer, and that's trade debt goes up, or eventually the dollar goes down. And when the dollar goes down, that means our living standards go down. We have to send them more things to get less things in return. And so living standards go down. That's number one. Number two, and even more importantly, is our defense base. And our defense industrial base is not bullets only. It's not fighter planes only. It's an entire ecosystem that backs all of that up. You look at the new work coming out of DoD, where they're talking about things like intelligence and AI and autonomous systems, lasers, all of these things that are going to be critical to us defending ourselves. We're not going to be able to do that if we don't have strong firms in the US. And the Chinese strategy is to go after, to gain global market share and attack our firms. And just last thing we're going to say, we're seeing that now, or we're going to see it in a sector called DRAMs, dynamic random access memory chips. These are memory chips that go into phones and computers and things like that. And the Chinese are putting tens of billions of dollars of writing checks to firms to unfairly compete with the Microns and the SK Hynix and the Samsungs of the world. They're going to harm innovation. They're going to reduce the market share of America and Korea. And they're going to do it that potentially at the expense of innovation in the US. So I think we have to come to grips with that kind of challenge.
Okay, terrific. And I know Derek's going to have some thoughts on that. But first, let me ask Deborah. Deborah, you set up this, or you're co-chairing a National Commission on Innovation and Competitiveness Frontiers. Can you tell us a little about that? It brings together, interestingly, business, labor, academics, and maybe others, all to talk about all of these issues. And can you tell us a little bit about how they're thinking about how those different groups think about these issues and what you're focused on, what your plan is likely to entail?
Thank you. Well, let me just start by saying, the whole purpose of the Council on Competitiveness, when it was created some 34 years ago, was to address from the private sector the challenges we were facing with Japan, which have already been alluded to in the discussion. But the real important thing I want to say, and we're talking around it, but again, is to come back to productivity. Competitiveness and standard of living are all related to a nation's ability to increase its productivity, maintain a high standard of living for its citizens, and as Rob has been discussing in some detail, to succeed globally in the marketplace with high value traded goods that command a premium. And those three metrics are still very, very valid today. And we are in a very low productivity era. The council did a report a few years ago with Gallup called No Growth, the long-term decline in US productivity. And right now, close to 38% of our GDP is in three sectors of the economy that have absolutely no productivity, ever escalating costs, and a decrease in delivery of value. Those, of course, are healthcare, education, and housing. And if we don't see rapid innovation and structural disruption in those three sectors, we're going to have a continued drain on our economy. The purpose behind the Council's new National Commission on Innovation and Competitiveness Frontiers really derives from the work we did back in 2004 when we did our National Innovation Initiative, led by the then CEO of IBM and the president of Georgia Tech, that led to the American Competes legislation, is to really address what can we do collectively as a nation to unleash a new era of productivity and to get our productivity up over the next 10 years to 3 to 4% annual productivity. This is a huge challenge, a huge metric. So what are we doing? Well, under the leadership of our great board, people such as Dr. Mahmoud Khan, Brian Moynihan, the chairman of Bank of America, president of Arizona State, labor unions, the president of electrical workers, we are putting together, and we have a fabulous group of leaders now, some over 500 experts looking at 4 big areas. And again, we've been talking about these, but the first is, how do we develop and invest and commercialize at scale these enabling platform technologies that are critical to our economy, our future, and national security? And Rob has mentioned some, I've mentioned others. We cannot cede this leadership to any other country in the world. And China is, with President Xi's civil military fusion, targeting all of these. If you just look at what China's investing in across the country through silent stakes and VC firms and targeting our universities, companies, AI, all of these, absolutely essential for our country's future. How do we deploy and develop and commercialize at scale? The second is, how do we leverage the whole future of production and sustainable consumption and the energy transformation? We seeded our manufacturing prowess, really starting in the time I was Assistant Secretary of Commerce. And Rob and I were actually working there at that time. And it's sort of a back to the future story. We developed every single technology innovation path in flat panel displays. And there was a vibrant ecosystem. And yet, did we commercialize any at scale? No, because when it came time to manufacture, our companies let all of that go to Asia. And we have to restore not 20th century manufacturing, but we have to have 21st century production with an energy competitive infrastructure in this country. And then the third, which I've alluded to, that we're going to address in a big way, is looking at all the innovation ecosystems. We don't have a competitive cost structure in the United States. We finally got our corporate tax structure down to a level that's commensurate with the average in the OECD. We finally got a territorial tax system where we could repatriate profits into the United States. We have a very innovation hostile regulatory environment. I mean, the reference to Lucent is interesting. I remember when Pat Russo, the CEO, was a member of the council, they changed their whole corporate headquarters in Lucent to Paris. Because why? Because of our punitive, anti-competitive product liability laws. We have to address standards. We've ceded all the international standard bodies to non-Americans, particularly the Chinese. We're not focusing on implementing and securing our intellectual property. Just think of the fact that if China implemented their existing intellectual property laws, and this comes from the Commission on the Theft of Intellectual Property that I serve on, we would have over 1.3 trillion more in GDP. And yet we continue to allow this systemic theft and targeting of our intellectual property through cyber attacks. And then, of course, we have the whole issue around trade and a really unfair trading platform for the United States. And these things have to be addressed as part of an innovation strategy. And then finally, the other component that is very, very critical is our talent, our workforce, our skills, the de-investment in that, and the need to completely upskill our workforce. And very importantly, and this is a big part of our commission, we can't just have our centers and hubs of innovation in the coastal cities or in a place like Austin or Chicago. We have to return to revitalizing all these regions in the United States. Why can't we have policies that give huge incentives to establishing manufacturing and production infrastructure in the United States like our competitors have? So we're going to be looking at all of this as an integrated system and present this December at our National Competitiveness Forum an initial roadmap that we'll present to whoever becomes president of the United States. And we have to have, finally, totally new models of public-private partnerships with financing that goes way beyond, as I said earlier, the venture capital model that cannot be deployed for the scale of investment and partnerships and collaboration we need in this country. We have all the capabilities. We're just not integrating what we need in a systemic way. And quite frankly, we are being very naive, in my view, and very passive in not addressing the threat to our innovation ecosystem in this country by the massive intellectual property theft and targeting and bad actor behavior coming from China.
Okay, so that's a good tee to back to Derek, because let me just ask you kind of what you think about all of that agenda from both Rob and Deborah, and why, what's wrong with that in the sense vis-a-vis China? Because, you know, you've said that China does a lot of things wrong, or isn't as big a behemoth as we all seem to think in many areas between their demographics, their debt, and probably micro capabilities as well that you would touch on. But I heard when I watched again the debate you and Rob had last year at Brookings about a year ago, you had an interesting turn of phrase: China can't replace us, but they can hurt us. And you know, can you elaborate on that, and whether that gets to the point where, I'm sorry to bring in another thing, that I reread Jared Diamond's book Collapse recently, you know, about Easter Island and sort of all the trees being denuded as one example of how we've sort of allowed that to happen, looked around and realized we don't have, you know, a manufacturing base. So if China can hurt us in that way, don't we need to do something more proactive about it along the lines of what, you know, Rob and Deborah have talked about before it's too late? Maybe that's introducing another dimension, but you can ignore that last part if you just want to focus on the first part.
There are definitely points of overlap, even though they're also down the road from those points of disagreement. You know, when we're talking about the defense industrial base, if the Defense Department consistently over time says these are technologies we need to have superiority in, you don't think at that point about like, well, what's the most efficient way to fund them? He's like, we have to fund them, and we're going to lose money, and that's the way it goes. Deborah, about productivity, I absolutely agree that we're in a low productivity period, especially as compared to, as Rob was saying, 10 to 15 years ago, and we need to raise U.S. productivity. So there are elements of agreement here, and of course, I certainly agree that we need to respond to Chinese predation. I've been shouting that from the rooftops for 15 years. Now there's more of a consensus that we need to do that. But the issue, of course, that you wanted to get to, Matt, is what's the best way to do these things, staying off of just responding to China, and I can address that if you want, but talking about part of the response to China being industrial policy, there are real pitfalls for us in that that are separate from, I think, effective responses to China. I'm trying to come up with a catchy phrase: cost, competition, and what's critical. And I don't really know how to do it as 3 C's because there's this W in there. But let's use the semiconductor bill that was in the NDAA, but not funded last month, to try to make this concrete. Costs matter. We're already running an enormous debt. Hopefully that will deficit. Hopefully that will fade as we get a solution to COVID and can resume normal economic activity. But the semiconductor bill is supposedly funded at $23 billion. And that's just not going to happen. It's not like the Chinese or the Koreans or the Taiwanese or anyone else is like, oh my goodness, we don't have $24 billion. I guess we just have to give up. We're going to get in a battle of competitive subsidies that are going to drive the costs of these actions, of industrial policy actions, up. That doesn't mean we never engage in that battle. It means that we should recognize what the true cost is. Competition. The initial semiconductor bills, they were fixed, but to some extent, but they initially didn't cap funding for an individual firm. And some of the advocates wanted the bulk of the funding to go to one firm because that firm was saying it was going to start first, which, by the way, was not convincing. We're going to end up, if we're not careful, picking winners, which you know is a catchphrase, but also even encouraging corruption. And I don't mean handouts to individual politicians, but people saying, my area of the country has the better firm, give me the taxpayer money that is coming from other areas of the country. That's another problem. This is something the Chinese do. They spend tons of money everywhere. They waste an enormous amount of it, and it's determined in part by corruption rather than the actual promise of what the firms are doing with regard to innovation. And finally, I want to get to questions, but we're all acting as if we can agree on critical goods that industrial policy should support. And we even, I think the three of us and many other people would say advanced semiconductors are a critical good. But that's a moving target. For one thing, it's going to change over time. And for another thing, what I consider to be advanced semiconductors is not necessarily what someone with a Texas Instruments plant in their district considers to be advanced semiconductors. I'm not picking on Texas Instruments. I'm trying to say there's a real issue here, even in semiconductors. Personal protective equipment appears critical right now. How could it not be? But masks are easy to make. Maybe they're not critical anymore, much less going off to the races with people coming and saying, hey, my industry is critical. So responding to China in a costly way, yes. Defending our defense industrial base, yes. Raising productivity, which, as Deborah's pointed out, is a broad spectrum economic action, not just about innovation. That's all true. But let's be serious about industrial policy. We're going to have very narrow areas to support, because otherwise the cost is going to be huge. We're going to lend ourselves to ever widening federal subsidization because everything is critical. And we run the risk of suppressing competition rather than enhancing it.
Okay, terrific. So let me ask Rob. I do want to take a couple of questions, and if you guys will indulge and the audience will indulge, we'll maybe go to 9:50. But let me just ask Rob to respond to that, and let me challenge you in saying, can we pull off the things that you've laid out? I mean, we deliberately on our report put a picture of the Apollo 11 launch and people looking at it. And, a little trite, but the point we're trying to make is back then there was kind of buy-in and people really wanted to, to get behind a big effort like this. So 3 challenges. 1, debt, which Derek has highlighted. Can we afford this? Second, can we get over the partisanship and the divide? Maybe I've already partly answered that by talking about partisanship being overcome, but still, it seems like when the rubber hits the road or when the money is being asked for, that's an obstacle. Can we pull that off in 2020? And then the final area is, do we have the best minds in the US government? That feels like a big difference from back in the Apollo program, that we don't necessarily, with no disrespect to people in government, and I've served a long time in government and have the highest respect, but we're not necessarily drawing people with the right technical expertise and so forth. So can we do all of this against all of that backdrop? And is it important enough that we should try to figure out how to overcome those problems?
Sure. So look, the issue of cost is similar to saying, can I afford to put on new shingles on my roof, even though they're leaking? I don't really care about cost. I have to put the shingles on my roof or else my house will decay. That's where we are today. So, and when it comes to cost, I mean, Deborah and I remember this because we were both in the Commerce Department way back when in the 80s. Back in the 80s, we were investing as a share of GDP over $110 billion more than what we're investing today. We did it in the 80s. We didn't bankrupt anybody. So look, the issue isn't cost. The issue is priorities. We don't make this a priority. We could reduce entitlement spending, which I support. Now, don't get me wrong, that's hard to do. We could raise taxes on particularly higher income Americans, which we should do. Lots of things we could do. The money is not the issue. The issue is political priorities. Second thing, Derek, about picking winners. Yes, we are picking winners. Now, the question is, why could you do that? The answer is because the economic evidence by scholar after scholar is so clear that the externality from many, many technology investments that companies make is huge. So the societal rate of return of many technology investments is vastly higher than the private rate of return. Private companies don't care about that, nor should they. They only care about their rate of return. By definition, that means the society has to pick winners. We have to identify those technologies that have big rates of return for society and are critical to our society, particularly defense. Yes, that means picking winners. Now, the key to that is not to pick, I don't want to pick analog chips over digital chips, and go with TI versus Intel. We don't know enough about that, but we do know that advanced chips going down smaller and smaller and next generations are going to be critical. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And then, Derek, to your point about, we're getting into an arms race. We're in the arms race. No question we're in the arms. We're not going to, if we subsidize chip fabs to come to the US, it's not going to make them invest more. They're already subsidizing it massively. So we're not even close to that. So, our choices is simply to say, well, we're going to lose and no more chip fabs in the US. And then, Matt, to your point about do we have the capabilities? there's an enormous, large, highly qualified technical staff in the US government. Places like NASA, places like NIST, places like DARPA, places like DOE. We have a lot of really, really sophisticated engineers, scientists, and other folks in the government who know about these technologies. The one thing we don't have is we don't have a body. I mean, we sort of had that back in the 80s when we had the Commerce Department Office of Technology Commercialization, which Deborah headed. We eliminated that. So we don't have quite the analytical capabilities that we should have. NIST plays some role in that. So I think, yeah, we need to beef that up, but I don't see any reason. There's no reason we couldn't do that. There's no reason it couldn't attract very talented and capable people who want to understand the business sector and innovation dynamics.
Okay, terrific. Deborah, I'm going to let you respond to some of that, but by introducing, we've just got a terrific bunch of questions here, and I'm not going to be possible to get through all of them, but let me sort of sneak in two questions that have been asked, and others can respond to these as well, which is, how does COVID change your view of innovation strategy in any dimension? Because I can think of several. Are we highlighting the right priorities? Does this affect our competence relative to China? Seems to be able to, to respond to this more resiliently than we've been able to. Are there long-term implications of that? So those are variations on this basic question from an audience member about COVID-19 and the impact on innovation strategy. And then the other question that somebody's asked, which I wanted to ask about if we'd had time, which is very different, is a lot of the ideas for industrial policy, they're out there, whether, Peter Navarro's or Joe Biden's Buy American plans seem to run up against some of our international obligations and could piss off some of our allies. So is this something we should be worried about, or does that not matter? And maybe Deborah, if you want to take either of those or respond to any of the rest, please go ahead.
Thank you. Before I answer those, I just want to make a comment on the last discussion about next generation advanced microelectronics. What hasn't been discussed here yet is we are at the end of Moore's law. CMOS technology has reached really its limits. That's why, in part, we have productivity loss now. We have to leapfrog into the next generation. And everything we're talking about in the digitization of everything depends on these microelectronic space. And so if we're worried about cybersecurity, we're worried about, defense systems that are dependent now on artificial intelligence, sensors, all of that depends on the electronics. That is such a foundational platform for the future. As I said earlier, we have to lead in that. And so I just want to make that point. On the issue of COVID, I think that, one thing that first of all, in the case of the United States, it's really a complex systems issue and how we responded and dealt with it and where we are right now. But one thing that came out so glaringly in the early days, which is absolutely shocking, is that we had hollowed out the entire supply chain in this country for the production and the logistics for advanced pharmaceuticals, for medicine, and for, of course, medical devices. And yes, something that's not high tech like PPE. Now, why was that done? Cost, efficiency, serving other customers. But we did not focus on resiliency or security. And I think we're going to see, as a result of COVID now, that we will put much more attention on resiliency and security, and perhaps not as much on cost and efficiency. Because at the end of the day, when you need medicines, when you need ventilators, when you need all these things, the cost doesn't really matter. And the Council on Competitiveness is going to be releasing at the end of this month with our leadership a very powerful redo of a report we did on enterprise resiliency called Transform, and we're going to address these things. Also, on a positive sense, the COVID response in the United States pushed us very quickly into the digital world. Online learning, telemedicine, we were able to break through regulatory barriers that made it impossible to have cross telemedicine consults because of state laws. We saw a lot of positive things in how quickly the country moved into the digital space, which again, in the future depends on these microelectronic devices as the underlying platform. Another dimension of COVID, of course, is the disparities between the haves and the have-nots. And we still have now children that are being forced to learn remotely who don't even have, a laptop to do their work. It's ridiculous that our country doesn't have universal broadband access. That's just a fundamental infrastructure that we should have throughout our nation. So COVID has really revealed some positive things as we've moved to other ways of doing work and living through the digital world, including, our ability to have this conversation today. But it's also revealed many, many problems and disparities in our overall systems and how our individual citizens are able to respond. On the issue of allies and partnerships, and this is something we're working on very strategically at the Council on Competitiveness. And our university presidents actually are buying into this as well, which is quite interesting. We need to now refocus our international science and technology collaborative efforts to work with our close allies. A country, for instance, where we have huge commonality of interest and capabilities with Australia. Australia is a leader in the world in quantum computing. Many, many things that we need to do to up the scale of collaboration with Australia, with Japan, with the UK, yes, the Five Eyes, but also I would include Japan. If we're going to lead in next generation semiconductors, we got to work with Japan and Korea and work very intensely with these allies. And I would include some partners in the EU, but not all of them. And on the issue of trade, look, the tariffs of President Trump, in my view, were a red herring, but at the same time, they brought to the score a lot of issues in the inequality and the lack of access and the lack of transparency in our trading relationships with even some of our close partners. Let's have a movement to get rid of all tariffs. They're a 20th century relic. And let's put together new trading platforms that, yes, advance everybody's interest, but do so in a fair way. And one issue of trade policy that gets very little attention is competition policy. If you look at the European Union, they have used competition policy and antitrust as a huge non-tariff barrier. And all of their cases on antitrust always attack non-European companies. So we have a lot to do on this front. But the most important on the latter point is let's work closely with our allies, with countries that have similar values and democracies, and advance all these things together and do so in a way that gives us capability at scale and deepens our leadership in the world.
Okay, that's terrific, and a lot of those topics are really important and deserve each their own, multi-hour or day conversations. But that's terrific agenda for future events. Let me just quickly ask Rob. I think we may have lost Derek. I hope he comes back. But Rob, let me ask you if you want to respond either on the COVID or the kind of international dimensions of this, whether there's a, opportunity as Deborah laid out, or whether there are problems with the WTO, with allies in pursuing some of these policies.
Sure. So I think on the Buy American thing, our position would be we should have reciprocity. There are a number of countries that we don't have reciprocity. They don't really buy American goods, don't have a fair shake when it comes to their government procurement or other kinds of government related procurements. Any country in my mind that has that, then we should open up to them. I mean, Australia, Deborah mentioned, they generally will buy American goods. We buy theirs. China, no way. They don't even pretend to be open to our market. So I don't think we should just go buy American. I kind of go buy allied, if you will, reciprocity allied.
Okay. All right. Terrific. That's very helpful. I'm afraid we have not only reached our time, we've gone past it. And I realize that the problem with having such knowledgeable and talented panelists is that we could do this for hours, and we're going to have to do it again. But I really do appreciate Deborah, Rob, and Derek, who I guess we lost, unfortunately, at the end, but for your thoughtfulness on these topics and the work that you all do, which I really benefit. I'm not just flattering you. Well, I guess I am flattering you, but it's also true that I really benefit myself from reading and learning from all of you, from conversations like this and from what you write and think about these topics. And so I really commend to our audience the work of all three of these guests, because they're really very thoughtful, even if they don't agree on everything. that's good. So thank you all. Thanks to our audience for their indulgence, and we will be continuing to talk about these topics going forward, and I appreciate your support and attention. So with that, I will close us off here. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Derek and Absentia. Bye-bye.